Welcome to Teis Talks, where we discuss all things faith and family. We have such a special guest with us today.
It's a special time. This is the first time we've ever videotaped a Teis Talks, and we're excited about that. We have with us
J.T. Gorman.
He's a missionary to the deaf. You may not have been able to guess that. He is with a mission board called Silent Word Ministry, who we've been associated with for many years. We know the founder of Silent Word. His name is Ted Camp, and great ministry. And you've started a ministry called Heart for the Deaf.
Yes, sir.
And we're glad that you're here this morning.
So we want to hear what you were telling us earlier about your testimony. Start from the beginning, how you ended up in the deaf ministry.
All right, absolutely. Thank you again. Such an honor to be here with y'all. So I grew up in a pastor's home. My father's a pastor in Western Kentucky for the last 25 years. My mom, a Christian school teacher. So I grew up involved in ministry and getting to serve God with my family. And as I entered into high school, I was really struggling with my will versus God's will. And then when I went to college, I attended Pensacola Christian College in Florida. And as a freshman, I was deciding major, and I told God, I'm willing to do anything for you except be a preacher. And I found out it's never good to tell God you're not going to do something. So as time progressed, I went and I started as an engineering major. And one thing I was not expecting as I started my freshman year, I began losing my hearing. So I was going to the church services, I was going to all my classes, and all of a sudden I was struggling to be able to hear all of those different times and lectures. And all of a sudden I was just really battling with, okay, God, why is this happening? So eventually I ended up having to get hearing aids, and we had a Christian Service Expo where they have all of these different ministries where you can go and sign up and get involved. And before that day, I prayed. I said, God, lead me to a ministry that needs help. Didn't know what I was asking for at that time. So I went and I looked at all the different ministry tables to sign up. And I saw, okay, this one has a lot of names. This one has a lot of names. This one has a lot of people signed up. And then I went over to the deaf ministry table. No one had signed up. There were no names. So I went up to, his name is Ben Muldoon. He's now a missionary to the deaf in Romania, one of my best friends. And I went up to him and I asked, why has no one signed up? He said, it's a hard ministry. It's the largest unreached people group in the world.
Wow.
The largest unreached people group.
Yes, sir. Largest unreached people group in the world, because there are deaf in literally every country around the world. And most times, even if a missionary will take years to learn that language, that local spoken language, but then they meet someone that's deaf, they don't know how to share the gospel with them. So globally, less than 2% of deaf have been reached with the gospel.
Wow.
So at that time, I said, okay, sign me up. I'm convinced. So in that time is when I also had started losing my hearing. So before that point, I knew no sign language. I didn't even know the ABCs or anything in sign language.
How many years ago was that?
That started back in 2016.
2016.
Wow.
So I was 18 years old. And then I started just immersing myself into deaf culture, into deaf ministry. There was actually a deaf Baptist church there in Pensacola that I went to on Thursday nights to train and study under the pastor, learning about how to work with the deaf, how to preach, teach, work with the deaf. And then I met several of the leaders in our mission board, Silent Word Ministries.
Now, when you go to a deaf church, is everybody just speaking is it quiet and everybody's speaking to each other in sign language?
Yes, everyone's using sign language, but no, it's definitely not quiet.
Oh, is that
In fact, deaf groups are some of the loudest you'll ever meet.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, sir. So I began going and learning how to preach and teach with the deaf. It's very different being a visual language. So at that time, I just immersed into deaf culture, and I began learning how to interpret. Have some funny stories about my first experiences interpreting some of the different aspects of the language and learning, but eventually the Lord was able to give me a lot of opportunities for interacting with more deaf, and then being able to travel to different countries working with the deaf, even as a college student. So at that time, I was still engineering major, And I continued for 2 years. And during that whole time, I had no peace. I had no joy. I was doing what I thought I wanted to do, but I really had no idea what God had in store. So during the summers, I went and worked with the Bill Rice Ranch Ministries, a camp in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and out in Williams, Arizona. And they had
That camp was started specifically because of the need of reaching deaf people, and they have a deaf camp, at least one deaf camp every year. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. So that camp was started for the deaf. The founder's daughter was deaf.
Yeah.
And Dr. Bill, he was wondering about, okay, how can I share the gospel with my own daughter?
Mm-hmm.
So him and his wife, they started the Bill Rice Ranch, and now it's been running for many years. And so I was able to actually grow up as a kid going to this camp. My dad, pastor in Western Kentucky, he brought groups every year. So I grew up going to the hearing camp. And then after I started losing my hearing, they asked me about coming and working with the deaf camps. So they had me work half the summers out at West Branch in Arizona, half the summers out at the Bill Rice Ranch in Tennessee. And I started getting around these deaf. And it was between my sophomore and junior year that I went and I was working out at West Branch. And I was struggling with my will versus God's will. And I was up on the top of the mountain I had just heard a message from Dr. Bill III, and he had preached about how we need to be willing to serve God wherever he leads. And until you come to that point of surrender, and he shared a part of his personal testimony where he said, God, I'm willing to do anything for you except go to Africa. And he said that until he was willing to go anywhere to serve God, he wouldn't use him. So until that point of surrender, then God could use him. And I immediately was under conviction, realizing I'm in the same place. I told God, I'm willing to do anything for you except be a preacher, because I had seen with my parents being involved in ministry and church that's a hard life. So I didn't want anything to do with that. But that summer, when all of these deaf kids started coming and, playing, having fun and games and sports, and then that first night we started all of the services in preaching about Jesus Christ. The first time we mentioned about Jesus, Jesus, we fingerspelled it, and all the kids start looking at each other. They said, is that another camper? Has he not shown up yet? Who is that? The kids literally had no understanding of who Jesus was. So during that week, we start from the basics. We start Adam and Eve and all the way through explaining to the gospel. And that Thursday, many of the kids, actually all of them, 100% of the kids, the deaf kids that came, all trusted Jesus Christ for salvation that week.
Wonderful?
And it just overwhelmed my heart. Yeah. And I became so burdened. And I realized that this is so much more joy and fulfillment than I could ever get anywhere else. So I went back for my junior year there at PCC, and I said, okay, I'm changing majors. I'm going to be involved in youth ministry education for deaf missions. And my advisor, he said, changing from engineering to youth ministry education, he said, there's not a lot of overlap. You're going to have to add on maybe a year and a half, 2 years of college. I said, no way. I'm ready to start ministry now. So he said, well, you're going to have to graduate. So I rearranged my schedule. I said, will this work? And he said, you are going to hate yourself. I was taking 12 classes a semester, and I was working 2 jobs at the same time to pay my way through college. So I'd have classes all day. My last night class would finish at 9:50. I would go start work at 10 o'clock and work through the nights. And then on weekends, I had another job so that I could pay my way through college. But I was very determined. The Lord gave me what I needed to help during that time. And as I progressively began losing more of my hearing, I ended up using hearing aids, and then I was able to graduate in 2020, the year of COVID. And at that point, everyone said, oh, well, COVID's kind of halted everything, so you're going to have to wait. I said, no way. I said, I need to get involved in this now. So I joined with Silent Word Ministries, and then I started training with several of the different missionaries. So I went and took several months with different deaf missionaries, getting to train under their ministries. And then I went to go start my own deputation, raising support as a missionary. But because of COVID, there were almost no churches that were taking on missionaries for support. A lot of them were struggling enough just to support their own missionaries. Yeah. So I'm going to all these churches trying to raise support. And I'm not seeming to get any support. And then they all say, oh, because COVID, because COVID, because COVID. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to use COVID as an excuse. And that time I looked, all the plane tickets for international travel was super inexpensive, super cheap. So I started flying to all these different countries, getting experience working with the deaf. So I would go to other countries. I would learn their sign languages. So sign language is not universal. Each country has their own sign language. There are some similarities. So as I went and traveled to these different countries, the first I was able to go to El Salvador. Went a few times, and I was able to learn their sign language, and then over to Peru, lengua de señas peruana, and then I was able to go over to Israel. Amazing to be able to share the gospel with the deaf there in the Holy Land, where many of the deaf there, I would explain Jesus, and they said, oh, he was a good teacher, a good prophet. I say, more than that, he is Messiah, the Son of God. And they go, we've never heard that before.
Is that right?
That's true.
Now, so when you're doing the sign language, is it all similar in the different parts of the country, or did you just say that every language is different, even in sign?
Correct. So each country has their own. There are some similarities. So for those countries that are Spanish speaking, so between El Salvador, Peru, some of the Spanish speaking countries, the sign languages are similar. So between the lengua de señas mexicano versus the Peruvian versus the El Salvadoran sign languages, there are similarities. So after learning the Peruvian sign language, it was pretty easy to pick up the others. And then over working in Africa with my wife, we were able to learn the French sign language. A lot of the countries over there used French sign language. So me and my wife, we learned French sign language. So every time I was preaching and teaching, when my wife was teaching, we would use French Bibles and we would write out everything in French and then use French sign language there to work in the deaf churches and schools.
Wow. So, so the signs can be totally different and not similar at all.
Correct.
Wow.
So I thank God for giving me the skill in being able to learn languages. It's definitely a God thing. It's nothing I could do of myself. And one thing that often I will encourage people is that God can use us in our areas of weakness.
So you can have an accent, an English Sign Language accent.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. So the sign in English or ASL is accent. For deaf, they call it accent.
Oh.
Because it's an accent of the hands.
Okay.
Yes, sir. So a lot of times with learning all the different sign languages, going and traveling the different areas, it's been a blessing. So while I was working there at the Bell Rice Ranch as a counselor, and then I started preaching for some of the summers there at the deaf camps and then several others. Last summer, I had 13 weeks of camps, 8 weeks of deaf camps here in the U.S. and 5 weeks of deaf camps over in Africa.
Wow.
In the countries of Benin, Togo, and Niger. And next year, we plan to add even more. So during my time there at the Bell Rice Ranch, I met my wife, Rebekah. And my wife, Rebekah, something a little bit unique about her, she is completely deaf. And her parents are missionaries to the deaf, and they're completely deaf as well. They met at a deaf Bible college in Ringgold, Georgia, called Harvest Baptist Deaf College. And that's where they met, and then God called them to start churches in the state of South Carolina. So currently, a few years back, they planted the first and only Baptist church for the deaf in the whole state of South Carolina. And now this next year, they're planning on starting the second.
Oh, really?
So he has an incredible testimony. He grew up there in Greenville, South Carolina. His parents met at Bob Jones University, and then after they were married, they were involved there at the college and the church and just faithfully serving God in the ministries there at Bob Jones. But during that time, when they found out that their son was deaf, they never really learned much in the way of sign language. Here in the U.S., 95% of families of deaf will never learn sign language.
Is that right?
And when I first heard that statistic, I said, that can't be. I would think, like, if I had a child that was deaf, I would want to learn sign language. But unfortunately, with how the deaf institutes with the schools work from K through 12, many times deaf are sent off to deaf institutes where they rarely get to see their own families.
Mm.
So for Brother Rusty, my father-in-law, he grew up in a Christian home. He went to church every week faithfully with his family, but they had no interpreter. So he would see the cross and had no idea what it meant. He would count ceiling tiles or play around on the floor, but had no understanding of who God was. It wasn't until he was 27 years old that he heard the gospel for the first time. A deaf missionary met him and explained the gospel in sign language. And he said, all this time, my family has known God, but I never even knew who he was. So then he went to Bible college, met his wife, and then now they are planning churches for the deaf there in Greenville, South Carolina. And their daughter, who is also deaf, Rebekah, we met there at the Bill Rice Ranch, and during that time I started traveling and serving with their family. We would go to church deputation traveling together, and God was able to use that in miraculous ways. We were both able to raise our support, and during that time, we started dating. My father-in-law, he actually came to me, kind of a peculiar situation. We were at a men's retreat, and it was just the two of us in the room, and he looked over, he said, JT, if God ever leads you to date and marry my daughter, I want to go ahead and give you permission now. Good night. My jaw dropped to the floor. I'm like, what? So during that time, I ended up taking several days for fasting and praying, just seeing if this was God's will. And God gave me a lot of just peace and clarity in the situation, and we started dating.
Wow.
Get this, so first date, I took her on a hot air balloon ride. Gotta set that bar high. So we've been married. We just celebrated our 1-year anniversary, and God has blessed so much. We've already been now in 7 different countries working with the deaf. And it's been amazing how we have even more open doors and opportunities. We were able to plant a Baptist church for the deaf over in Benin, West Africa. In our first service, we had over 300 deaf in attendance.
That's amazing.
In other countries, there is such a huge need for deaf ministries and deaf churches. And I'm thankful that God has been able to use us. Our next big project, we are actually going to be heading to Sao Paulo, Brazil, and using their sign language, which is called Libras, which is the Portuguese sign language. So we've been learning that sign language now, and then this next year we are going to go over and help another missionary couple, Stephen and Abby Barrett, be able to start a church for the deaf there in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
That's amazing that you are doing that for the glory of the Lord Jesus Christ, and that we get to be part of that.
Yes, sir.
It's amazing when you are supporting missionaries, whether it's a missionary to the deaf or whatever missionary it is. When you support them, you are laboring with them together. And we're looking at reaching the most unreached people in the world, according to JT, and being part of that through our Faith Promise Missions giving. JT, what is the number or the population of deaf here in America?
That is a great question. Actually, there are not really a lot of statistics as far as knowing exactly the number of deaf and hard of hearing. It's several million that are here just in the U.S. and then even more globally. And
so we don't have a hard number is what you're saying.
Right.
Okay.
So if somebody wanted to say, I want to start a deaf ministry in our church, or a pastor and their family says, what do we do to reach the deaf in our community? What would you say is the first step?
Absolutely. So first step I always recommend is pray about it, because a lot of times God will use prayer for him to be able to work out his will. So praying for God to bring along someone that can be able to help in that ministry. My wife and I, we helped to start a deaf ministry at a church over in Knoxville, and there's a huge deaf population in that area. And we were like, they had reached out to us about what to do. So we said, pray about God bringing someone to that ministry that knows sign language that can interpret. And there was a college student that had graduated from Sword Deaf Baptist Bible College there north of Knoxville. And then she went there and started interpreting every week, and we were able to go and help start a deaf ministry, deaf Sunday school classes, and now for a lot of their events, for their services, sometimes they'll have over 50 deaf that are coming regularly. So we're thankful for God being able to bless in that ministry and many others. And a lot of times I just look back at starting in college, not knowing any sign language, not knowing how to work with the deaf. And a lot of times I consider the verse in 2 Corinthians where Paul is describing about the thorn in the flesh, saying, for this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. So how God can use my weakness, my hearing loss, for his glory.
Yeah.
Just as Romans chapter 10, verse 14, how then shall they call on him in whom they've not believed? And how shall they believe in him in whom they've not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how will the deaf hear the gospel without a preacher taking the gospel to them in sign language? And then the next verse, and how shall they preach except they be sent? And that's what me and my wife are doing now, serving as missionaries on deputation, raising support. Right now, we're able to stay in countries for short periods of times, between 6 to 8 weeks, but our goal is to be able to stay in these countries for longer periods of time, emulating the ministry of Paul, where he would go and help to start churches and start ministries and then teach and train and disciple people so that they can be able to take over those ministries and have more effectiveness than I ever could as an outsider, but being able to teach and train them to work with their own people groups and then being able to continue to replicate this style of ministry in other places and then be able to return to encourage, to be able to train even more leaders to continue to start more works.
Wow. JT, thank you so much for sharing with us. Before we're running out of time, before we quit, before we stop here, I want to make sure that the people that are listening will know how they can get in touch with you and get involved in Heart for the Deaf ministry. We want to make sure that they are able to do that. So I want you to listen very closely as JT tells you how you can get in touch with him. And if you miss that, get in touch with us at experienceliberty.com and we'll give you his information. But go ahead, tell us how they can get in touch with you.
Absolutely. I would check for our missions board website is silentword.org. Silentword.org. And you can contact me at my email, jt@silentword.org. Probably the best way to get in contact with me. And then if you're interested in starting a deaf ministry at your church, we have several people in our ministry that are equipped to do that, where they will go and stay at churches for periods of time to be able to help start ministries. And then I also have several missionaries in other countries that will reach out to me. Just had one missionary down in Mozambique, and he reached out to me, hey, we found out that our daughter is deaf. We want to be able to start a ministry for the deaf here also so that our daughter can have access to the gospel. So plan to be able to go and help them and several other missionaries with being able to start deaf ministries, start churches for the deaf in other countries.
That's great. And if they wanted to send you support, what would their address be?
Yes, so they're at silentword.org. You can give online, or they have the address where money support checks can be sent there to support our ministry. You can just denote it as Silent Word and then put -JT or Gorham, my last name.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing all of this. Thank you for listening. You can find this video on our YouTube channel, KVXL 101, or just click the link in the show notes and you'll be able to find us on there as well. So thank you for joining us. This is Teis Talks.
And it's more than a conversation.